welcome everyone to Seeing Each Other's Souls, Integration, Justice, and Imagination, presented by The Point magazine in collaboration with our friends at Plow. My name is John Baskin. I'm one of the founding editors of The Point, and I'm just going to talk for a few minutes to introduce the panel, and then I'll turn it over to Phil, Aaron, and Elisa. They'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then there will be 20 minutes for questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen to send in any questions, and our editor, Joey Keegan, will ask them to the speakers. So for those of you who are new to The Point, we're a 3 times yearly magazine of philosophical writing on everyday life and culture, based in Chicago and publishing since 2009. Plow, founded in 1920, so they have a bit of a head start on us, is an international magazine of faith, culture, and society that appears quarterly in print. Given the subject matter of this panel, it's worth noting that The Point is not a magazine of faith, but we've always welcomed religious voices in the magazine and seen religious themes as central to the dialogue about our moral and philosophical lives that we attempt to host in our pages. Tonight's panel is inspired by 2 extraordinary essays that take part in that dialogue and that ask questions which, although they are directed most obviously at the Christian church, also touch on many issues that affect all of us. Social justice, integration, the challenge of reckoning with an unjust history in the present, and the ways our imagination can shape our institutions. The 2 essays revolve around 2 figures who occupy, in a way, very different positions. Elisa Gonzalez's essay, No Good Has Come, is about the Calvinist author Marilynne Robinson, and specifically her newest novel, Jack, an interracial love story that raises questions about the possibilities for true recognition between Christians living in a society where their choices are still predestined, as Elisa puts it, by a history of violence and racial oppression. Aaron Robertson's essay, It Was More Than a Notion, is, on the other hand, about a famous institutional separatist. Aaron tells the story of the Reverend Albert Klieg Jr., a mid-century civil rights leader in Michigan who put little stock in the possibility of integration, coming to believe that Black Christians had to form their own spiritual and political institutions in order to shield themselves from the scourge of what he called white egocentrism in America. Still, I think the reasons for putting Aaron's and Elisa's essays in conversation will be obvious. Both Elisa and Aaron ultimately meditate through these figures on the possibilities for recognition, atonement, and grace between Christians concerned with, or merely marked by, the church's long legacy of racial ignorance and injustice. It is also worth noting a striking commonality between Elisa and Aaron's stories, which is that both speak of having become estranged from their faith as they became adults, a development that is in line with broad trends in their generation. And yet both of them, as the essays attest, seem to retain a sense that the church, either as an institution or as a shaper of our collective imagination, still has a crucial role to play in that generation's struggle for a more just world. So just to finish now with some formal introductions, and then I'll turn it over to them. Aaron Robertson is a writer and editor at Spiegel and Grau. I first became aware of Aaron's work when he sent us an essay on the Italian novelist Fleur Jaeghi, and I soon found out he was, despite being like 22, already an accomplished translator of literary fiction. Aaron's work has since appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, Foreign Policy, and elsewhere, and he's working on his first book, The Black Utopians, which extends from his essay for The Point and will be published by FSG in 2023. Elisa Gonzalez is a poet, essayist, and fiction writer. Her work has appeared in The Point, The New Yorker, and many other places, and she's the recipient of the 2020 Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award. Elisa's essay on Robinson was the first thing we published by her in The Point, but I sure hope it's not the last. Elisa is at work on a novel called The Awakenings, about an evangelical church dealing with the outbreak of an apocalyptic revival triggered by the 2016 election, possibly of some relevance to today's discussion. And our host tonight is Phil Christman. Phil is a lecturer in English at Michigan University and is the editor of the Michigan Review of Prisoner Creative Writing. His writing about literature, faith, criminal justice, and culture has appeared in the Hedgehog Review, The Point, and in his excellent column on books for Plow. In April of 2020, Phil authored an essay entitled How to Be White for Breaking Ground, a project to bring to bear the Christian humanist tradition on the year's major cultural events. He's the author of Midwest Futures, a book about Midwestern identity published by Belt last year. And his new essay collection, How to Be Normal, is forthcoming next year. So without further ado, on to you, Phil.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, thanks. I see 55 attendees, which is pretty cool on a Tuesday night. And thanks y'all for being here. This is really exciting for me. I'm the type of person who will, if I see a really brilliant piece of writing kind of floating around in my feed, I will postpone important work to read it. And I did that with both of these essays. Both of these essays were so good as to derail entire mornings. So I don't know a better compliment that I can give. So I think my first question is it's a little basic, but I to kind of get us started. I'm curious what the two of you learned about Christianity or about your own relationship to Christianity from the process of writing these, like, at once very learned and very personal essays about that deal with other people's faith in certain ways.
Sure, I can take it. So I grew up as a Baptist, and like I would say that I was a practitioner, pretty steadily, like through high school, and my relationship with the religion was always a bit complicated, but I would say that in writing about Albert Clegg Jr. and his church in Detroit, which is called the Shrine of the Black Madonna, I really realized how sort of individualistic I think my relationship with Christianity had been. So I'm agnostic now, but Clegg was known as one of the kind of the architects of what is known as Black liberation theology, and really it has a sort of collectivist ethos. It is concerned with the ways in which the church has failed to adhere to its moral mission for African Americans, but it's also articulating a way of life that is opposed to kind of constant self-serving, one that is strictly internal, I would say, like rather than a faith or a lifestyle that's looking out to other people. And the more I read about the church and Clegg's life and Black liberation theology, the more I realized that my time as a Christian, I think, was extremely personal, and I wasn't really, I guess, living in service of something larger than myself, frankly. And so realizing that, after the fact has been interesting.
That is very beautiful, actually. And now I have cause to reflect about my own time as a Christian. I was raised in a non-denominational evangelical fundamentalist church, or set of churches, I would say. And I think my what I would consider slipping away felt a lot like that exact kind of escape, where it was sort of hidden and very much in the mind. But it always seemed to me very clear that the kinds of ontological and ethical questions that I had been confronted with growing up, even if I was not offered what I thought of as satisfactory answers, were still extremely important. And when I first started reading Marilynne Robinson's fiction, I did find that someone was taking seriously what I would call like questions of belief and like the relevance of belief in the world, the way it acts in the world, not just in the self. So I guess that relates to what Aaron was saying to some extent. I was very hungry for that, I think. So in writing the essay, I was able to explore like more deeply my kind of own interest in like that, like why does it matter to me? And I think it matters. Well, once I read Lila, the fourth Gilead novel, I think, in a book club, and someone hated it, and I was like, how could you how could you hate it? Anyone can hate anything, of course, but it was kind of incomprehensible to me. And they said, well, it's totally crazy that anyone believes that kind of thing. And I thought the word crazy was, it really stayed in my head. Like, were all these people that I knew crazy, and also I think I was kind of interested in the fact that like so much of, at least, and I was also raised in a charismatic church, charismatic religious belief also looks pretty crazy if you're not attuned to its logic and justifications, right? Speaking in tongues, for instance. So I think through the essay, I was trying to grapple with, what Robinson, who is, a devotional member of the church, like, has to say about the church's failures, which was, that was the thing that pushed me away. But at the same time, like, there was so much about the impossibilities of Christianity that I still find extremely beautiful, and the ethical duties, I think, the ethical duties that Christianity imposes, like, on you, the individual, toward other people, feel even more kind of severe to me now, after like having thought about them through that essay so much than they, even did before. I think I was able to like look at my childhood as an adult and sort of say, well, there were some very important things here. They just weren't actualized the way that they could have been, maybe.
Yeah, that answers, I mean, both of your answers kind of brought up the issue of individuality in religion and in Christianity, almost as something that has both a healthy and an unhealthy side. Because like Aaron, what you were describing, I mean, and you were doing it in kind of a charmingly self-deprecating way that I think a lot of us can relate to. Like I grew up fundamentalist, and there was definitely this alternation between feeling like that this was something larger than myself that demanded certain things of me, and also feeling like there are certain ways that I think in the evangelical fundamentalist community, because the demands are so terrifying, we try to sort of sweeten the pill, and Christianity gets wedded to the promises of a kind of whitened American prosperity, and to kind of masculine entitlement of various kind, and in such a way that it eventually becomes like, I'm trying to have a good prayer life so that God will reward me with a smoking hot wife and a good job and a home in the suburbs. Or maybe those weren't your goals, that's more mine. So there's the unhealthy side of individualism in Christianity, but then there's also what Robinson is so good on, the way that Christianity kind of forces us to confront, kind of in this like only me and God kind of imaginative headspace, these impossible demands, and these beautifully impossible demands, and that kind of makes me think about a question that's posed in some ways by both of the figures that you're working with, because on the one hand there's Cleage and his separatism, which seems to go very, hand in hand with a kind of utopianism on the one hand, and then all of the Robinson's Gilead books are shadowed by John Brown, and by the example of the extremely militant and in many ways quite lonely prophetic Christian voice that he was. So we want, both of your essays also record a longing for the Christian church to be more truly engaged with struggles for justice. But can the institutional church, just by nature of being an institution, will it always fail at living up to those demands, simply because as an institution, it just has too much to lose? Is Christianity always stronger when it's this kind of marginal and messy and radical, and which often also means somewhat separatist force?
Yeah, so I can start with that. So one of the brilliant things about Clegg's church and his whole mission, so Clegg was nominally a part of the United Church of Christ. So he was a Congregationalist, and his approach to religion and life in general was always like ecumenical, meaning like that it was, a kind of liberal-minded Christianity that basically said, like, we have a lot to learn from various, traditions. Like, we are not, strictly sectarian. And the church began as kind of a mainline, church, like in the early 1950s. It's only like in the late 1960s where Clegg transforms it into this sort of separatist, institution. And the brilliant thing about him is that he was a Christian, but he was also one who was like vehemently attacking the foundations of the church. He thought that most of the people around him, including Black preachers in Detroit and elsewhere, represented what he called slave Christianity. Like, he did not hold back, really. And what he meant by that is that, and keep in mind that, like, this is, mid-century Detroit. There are kind of ongoing labor struggles, right? And you have this like liberal labor coalition that is trying to, move, Detroit forward, like into the future, right? Like in the late 1960s, when things in the city are looking pretty awful, right? A lot of Black preachers are just trying to get their congregation right, to make sure that their congregants have a job, like that they're employed, right? And so they are more willing to cooperate with, people like, Henry Ford II, who creates this like New Detroit committee, which is meant to kind of, attract corporate investment, into the city. But a part of that means that the control of resources in terms of thinking about, Detroit's future is largely in the hands of white corporate leaders like Henry Ford. II. Clegg sees this happening and says, no, right? It's time for us to be in complete control of the resources, right? In this city that is increasingly, Black now, Clegg asks, like, what are the mechanisms by which we as a community can gain and maintain power? he looks around him and sees that the church, for all of its kind of problems and historical injustices, is still like the beating heart of the Black community. It's this kind of organizational base, right? And so he says that, all right, I'm going to kind of imagine a form of, you know, militant, like corporate Christianity that uses the church as a launch pad for all these other programs. So the Shrine of the Black Madonna becomes not just a church, it becomes this sort of transit hub for activists, for labor activists, for sociologists, you know, educators, artists. It really, you know, stands in for the larger, like, you know, Black Power movement. I think I've lost the thread of your question, Phil, but the point is that Clegg was using the language of Christianity to undermine it, but also he was aware of its emotional appeal, of its of the possibility of, you know, of organizing a socially cohesive and like principled group with a vision, with concrete goals. Clay was not someone who embraced a sort of vague, you know, liberalism that has a, you know, a general sense of like the good, but hasn't actually defined what that looks like or what the program is to achieve it.
I think that's, I mean, that's interesting because I mean, it's unmaking the institution while sustaining the institution, which I think does really, it's very apt for what Phil is asking about. And the question made me think of the article that you shared with us beforehand by Carrie Day about the conversations at the Princeton Theological Seminary about reparations. And specifically, she has talked about the ethic of risk that has to be part of an like she's talking about a white institution, you know, or predominantly and historically white and exploitative institution of Christianity, and that there is a conflict between the value that places the upholding of the institution first, and a value of justice and equity, or you know, words that are very big but that you could use, and that there will be conflict between those. And that seemed to me just very, very true. Like, I don't know if Christianity is like better one way or another. I don't know how you could like unmake all of the institutions and throw it back into a marginal space, right? But I mean, although there are many like impossible dreams, I feel like anytime you talk about Christianity, you do enter into a utopian space, because you start talking about paradoxes and you start talking about promised lands and nowheres and hopes that will never be realized on earth. But it seemed to me that when you look at like recent drives, especially in the last year and a half, toward reparations, on like concrete reparations from Christian denominations and institutions, you do see those institutions to greater and lesser degrees starting to put themselves at risk, like starting to investigate that. And it's certainly not enough, but I think it's interesting because they do have to confront, I mean, like, this is no slight in particular on Southern Baptists, but the Southern Baptist Conference has a lot to answer for. I mean, it's, you know, it's not, but it's a really ugly history. And it's hard to know how to deal with it. So I don't know if that really answers your question either, but I think it's really interesting because I do wonder, like, what can different institutions do? And like, if we're talking about how they unmake themselves, we are probably talking about like white and powerful institutions as opposed to a lot of Black churches. And so there's like a tension there in terms of like, what is the institution that we're talking about? What form of church are we talking about as well?
Yeah, and like what the kinds of conversations and choices that we've seen, certain Christian denominations make in the past year in terms of reparations, like, there is precedent for that. So one of the most well-known calls for reparations was, 1969, the Black Manifesto. James Foreman was this coordinator with SNCC, and basically a bunch of Black activists made a call for white churches and synagogues to pay. Initially it was like $500 million in reparations for the establishment of things like a Southern Land Bank, like black media centers and universities. And this is 1969. A lot of churches, Black and white, look at Foreman and his supporters like he's insane. And you read coverage of that time, and what's fascinating is that a lot of people, their main complaint was that Foreman was abrasive and a bit rude. Right?
Wasn't one of the headlines like Black militant interrupts service or something? Yeah, it's
yes, that's exactly
very, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But Foreman, like there were people, of course, who actually did want, like all of that, right? Who wanted the hundreds of millions of dollars in reparations. But I think a lot of people knew that that was unlikely to happen, right? The point of that reparational call, it was a way to give the church an opportunity to like reimagine what it could be, to kind of like modernize, basically, right? And say, all right, the church, like even in the late 60s, was losing members, right? How do you, if you want to be an institution that is relevant to the lives of more Americans, what's a way to do that, right? And that, I think, is one of the most like radical parts about reparational calls. It's just an opportunity to reimagine like what a relationship looks like, whether that is, interpersonal or institutional. And that, I think, is exciting. I think too often the like debates about reparations, frame it as like as something like it that deprives, like one group for the benefit of another group. But that's a really simplistic way of looking at it, I think.
Or they focus on practicability as opposed to like what the call actually fundamentally, which is especially ironic when you have a church which is built on impracticability. I mean, like an entire faith that's built on impracticalities, impracticabilities. And it is asking you to reimagine, like, fundamentally.
Well, and it's interesting too, because like a lot of proposals that have been laughed at, in their historical moment for being, impractical and ridiculous, and how rude of you to even ask. You read about something like Foreman's 1969 proposal now, and you think, oh my God, how much better off would all of us be if they had just like done it? That's so often, the reaction that I have, like the fact that this wasn't done, that this wasn't pursued, now seems like the absurd, impractical, silly. I mean, people's lives would be better. The church would be probably in a much better position. We'd all probably be a little happier. And yeah, I like those examples, and I like the Princeton example as well, because and what was said about the churches are impractical to begin with. So maybe to start from the presumption, which I tend to do because I have a very Gen X skepticism and distrust of institutions. Runs very, very, very deep with me. But to just say the institutional church is never going to do the right thing because it's an institution is letting them off a little too easy. Actually, it is possible for these institutions to remember their purpose. And I always, there's this wonderful story that I think kind of, it's almost like this prophetic sign of how we could think differently about religious institutions. And it's that people would ask Dorothy Day what her financial plan was for keeping Catholic Worker going. And since I'm not Catholic, I don't remember who's the saint that you pray to when you have money problems. She was like, that's my plan. I pray to that saint. And then something always happens to keep the doors open for another week. Which is not, I mean, like no management school is going to teach you to run your institution that way. That it's irresponsible as the world defines things, but it seems like practical and good institution building, maybe from a prophetic Christian perspective.
It's one of those instances of Christian logic that I feel like is like just makes no sense from another scale. You have to like shift your entire way of measuring things. But people seem much more reluctant to do that kind of shifting when you start talking about things like racial reconciliations, reparations, etc. Or they're willing to talk about reconciliatory gestures, but other things are harder. It reminded me of my favorite, what you said reminded me of my favorite John Brown quote, actually, which is from a letter that he sent when he was in prison after Harper's Ferry. He says, I may be insane, and if I am insane, I am very so. But if that is so, insanity is a very pleasant dream to me. And I have loved that, because it's like, when you think about what he was saying, what he was asking the world or the United States, like for that to be insane makes what is logical absolutely ludicrous and horrifying. So I feel like we're often talking about plans or possibilities, like their craziness or relative practicability is like, that's the wrong measure somehow.
Yeah.
And so often, right, like one other thing about like reparational calls, or is that it is meant to challenge what we think of as like practical, right? I mean, we talk about things as practical or not because we have been socialized to think about like what's feasible, right? I mean, institutions like reinforce like these concepts, and individuals do as well, which is why when you have something like those calls, people don't really know what to do with themselves. They kind of freak out because, right, and to dismiss something as utopian, as infeasible, it's such a brilliant rhetorical move because it just closes off, right, like lanes of discussion and thought. But I actually think the so-called like the impracticality of the church, right, is actually one of its strengths. But I think a lot of people either abuse that or don't completely understand its implications. And that is what someone like Clegg, for example, what someone like John Brown, right, that's what they were trying to show us, is that like we can take what we've learned here and put put our feet on the ground, you know.
I mean, in that way, the call for reparations, it kind of resembles discussions around climate change, and especially climate justice. You know, someone will propose that, you know, the United States, which has benefited horribly from, you know, decades and decades of imperialism, should think about spending an amount of money helping other poorer countries, including most of our former victims, to leapfrog carbon in their economic development and go straight to renewables. People have proposed amounts of money, you know, well into the trillions, which of course, even my brain kind of goes, how are there that many dollars? How is this even going to work? But any objection you make to the impracticability of any particular climate, justice proposal can immediately be responded to with like, is letting the world burn practical? That doesn't seem very practical. Like what we are doing is already more impractical, more fantasy-based than the wildest proposals that have come from whoever you want to name. Which I mean, I just think that's very obviously true. And same with reparations. Is it practical to continue to live in a state of oppression and enmity? You know, is it practical that the doctor who may discover the thing that cures my cancer someday might have been shot by a cop last year? It's not practical either. Boy, I have like 50 things I want to ask right now, but I think we're actually getting pretty close to the 40-minute mark. So I think it's time for me to ask you guys what you're working on next, because I genuinely really want to know that.
Aaron, no, you go ahead.
Yeah, well, so I am working on a book called The Black Utopians, which it is sort of a broad history of Black utopian thought and practices, like in the U.S. from the founding of our country, well, even prior to that, to the present. But it's mostly telling the story through the lives of the people who made the shrine of the Black Madonna, what it was, this kind of fascinating bridge between the civil rights and Black Power periods. Like, not that those periods are so distinct, but they, I think, they represented a shift from a sort of like liberal approach to political and social change to one that embraced these impractical ideas and actually made a lot of substantial change. So that's what's on the slate for me.
I'm really excited to read it. I mean, I'm working on too many things, sadly, but I'm working on the novel that John talked about, called The Awakenings, which was born out of a kind of curiosity and meditation on the sort of apocalyptic death drive of the white evangelical church in the United States, and trying to sort of explore in fiction some of the questions that I felt like I had about, like, how were people supporting Trump, but like more broadly, like, what do you believe it is good to do on Earth? Like, do you think that your energies should be directed toward helping other people toward reparations and, toward restoration of this world, toward, climate justice? Or have you become so millenarian and fixated on an apocalyptic end times that the world to some extent is like invisible? So I feel like that sort of dichotomy of belief, which I think is outlined really beautifully in Francis Fitzgerald's History of the Evangelicals, of sort of the ways in which that sort of split of, do you believe in the perfectibility of the world, has affected the way that people act. But of course, because it's fiction, it's not actually that theoretical or like full of questions. Hopefully it is good fiction, but those are the things that were kind of on my mind as I started writing.
Also excited for that. It sounds amazing. I want it now.
Yeah,
me too.
quite frankly, when John described that premise, I was kind of mad. I was like, oh, why didn't I think of that? That's a really fun, that's such a fun, interesting, rich premise.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to both of those books, for real.
Phil, should we get the Q&A started, you think? I'm good? Great. Just remember, guys, the Q&A box should be functional. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please throw them in there, and we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes for a question and answer thing. So as for our first question, an anonymous attendee says, thanks for your candor. It seems that you both outgrew the faith formation that was provided for you. If so, I wonder, have you examined any other developmental models of spiritual life? People like Richard Rohr, James Cone, Chittiser, Marcus Borg, and other more progressive thinkers help me envision a, quote, grown up or at least growable faith that is more life-giving and communal. Then they say that these people allow this anonymous commenter to still be Christian. So do you guys have any thoughts on that?
To you.
I have read not all of those people, but I think most of the ones you mentioned. And I think it is true to say that I outgrew what I was given, and I'm still in a state of trying to answer ongoing questions. I mean, I think some of those writers, the ones I read, they do offer like very beautiful and compelling things. I mean, maybe this is too personal, but I feel like what I grapple with is not so much like, can I find people that I like ethically and theologically agree with, but like, do I still experience belief or like faith? And maybe that's just the way that I grew up, like the evangelical, like charismatic emphasis on the experience of faith. But I don't know. That's a gap I haven't been able to overcome.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I completely outgrew Christianity. I would say I'm sort of in a state of like uncomfortable suspension. I don't really know what's on kind of either side of of that, But what I mean is that I've taken a more kind of critical approach, to the lessons like that I learned as a child. Black liberation theology, like as it was laid out by people like James Cone and by Clegg, has been a wonderful way for me to just think about, how flexible belief is, right? And one of the great, contributions of liberation theology, generally, like whether that's in the US, whether that's in Latin America, or elsewhere, is that it is really kind of asking us to think about how can we take a group approach to the resolution of social ills. And so that, Clegg's example and Cone's example, right? They give me a sort of new compass, a new way of thinking about how faith can, or like, if not faith, then kind of, you know, a desire to be someone who who has like some kind of faith or some kind of scheme of, you know, belief. It kind of encourages you to use that as a model. And so I guess I would say that now I'm in a place where I am thinking about not not how can I, you know, distance myself from my Christian roots, but what's next? Like, what do I do now? Right? I have discarded, you know, certain things, but what can I like maintain and share with others that like in a way that makes us all better? So call me an idealist.
Great. We actually have a really good follow-up question to some of what you guys said. So Kylie asks, do you think that one can have that, quote, experience of faith that you guys both talked about outside of a church or religious setting? And how might we cultivate that sense of faith in a secular context? And should we?
Well, have you seen people like into like astrology and stuff, right? Like,
Or
and,
yoga.
yeah, and I'm kind of joking, but not really. Like, I mean, so again, back to Clay, right? The church was always responding to the social like trends of the day. So it moved like in the 1960s and early, you know, 70s from a strictly like Black nationalist church to the like mid, you know, 70s and 80s. The church started to reflect what we would think of as like a new age approach to faith. So instead of like viewing, right, like politics and kind of other forms of institutionalism as the solution like to our problems, it became much more inward, you know, more kind of individualistic, right? Society can't transform until the self is transformed, until the inner self, right, is really discovered. And some people view that shift as a tragedy, right? Like as a movement away from social engagement. But that view, I think, establishes a false dichotomy, really. But the point is that I think nowadays we're kind of in a moment where there is a sort of similar mistrust, right? You know, in institutions, you know, generally, regardless of your political background, and so some people turn to activism, like as a kind of faith. Some turn to tarot and or crystals, right? And it, like like that has its connotations of class dynamics and all that. But the point is that I think a lot of us are in sort of seeker mode now, and it's not clear like whether there is one kind of main avenue, right? But I do think that we all have to channel our hope in something.
I think it's hard to live a faithless life. I mean, like a completely faithless one. I think seeker mode is a good description of it, honestly. And you know, when I think about like my faith, you know, for instance, like I believe so deeply that people are like capable of things that like are truly like seemingly impossible. I mean, like you know, this is gonna sound really dumb, but like I believe in love. You know, I believe in goodness. I believe that people can like enact those things in their lives, and I mean that, you know, like that people are capable of acting against their own self-interest. You know, whether that can change society or is possible at a societal scale, you know, that is a much more difficult question. But the fact that some people keep like pressing on that is like a kind of if not divine act, then it certainly has some of that like completely like, I don't know, that feeling of like impossibility that I associate with God, you know, with a God of some kind. So I do think there's that. I mean, I do think you have to be careful what you put faith in, not just because you might end up in a scary cult that is like investigated in the New York Times, but also just like it's very easy to like give so much energy to something, and sometimes you regret that.
Mhm.
Thanks a lot, guys. We have another question here. This one's for Aaron. Hey, Aaron, it's John Michael Cologne. This question's for you. The point editor, by the way, for the audience. One thing I adored about your beautiful essay was its elegiac and mournful tone, mourning as I read it, both your own loss of faith and the loss of this utopian Black community. You have a clear admiration for many aspects of Clegg's community in ways that both compares and contrasts to your Christian experience. My question is this: as a political matter, how can we encourage the enriching effects of Black nationalism, say a marginalized group gaining economic control over the community, a sense of belonging, the promotion of culture and pride, etc.? So how can we encourage that and distinguish them from the effects of nationalism in the bad sense, namely authoritarianism, exclusion, and scapegoating of outsiders, treating culture as a kind of property, self-appointed ethnic spokespeople, etc.? And maybe more specifically, on this front, can we learn from the experiences of the Clegg community?
Yeah, great question. And hi, John. So I still think that when people, and maybe I'm crazy, but I think that when people hear the words Black nationalism, immediately flags go up and people are like, oh my gosh, like, right. But when Clegg was talking about a very specific thing. So, 1954 comes around and, Brown versus Board like passes, and a lot of people think that desegregation is going to like transform social relations among people, and certainly it did, right? But Clegg viewed this sort of talk about integration like as a good in itself, as like that was insufficient. When people talk vaguely about integration, I mean, what are they talking about? Clegg's contention was that most of us don't know what we're talking about. Like when we say integration, when we want our schools to be integrated or our neighborhoods to be integrated, what do we want? Do we want people just to live next to each other and that's it? That is one view, but Clegg was saying that there's a risk that one, you kind of like lose sight of a larger vision, right? Once you attain this goal, like, are you done with it, right? But also Clegg's problem with the idea of integration was not that like he was this racist who didn't work with white people. He did all the time. Clegg's thing though was that the purpose of Black nationalism is so that we retain like our own, like a sense of who we are as people, as individuals, as a community. Clegg's like he understood Black nationalism as a form, like as a way of maintaining your own values, right? And not being swayed necessarily like by the mainstream thinking, right? Not wanting the same things that like that that other people wanted, right? Not wanting, like, not using wealth as the metric of success, for example. So that is what Clegg meant by Black nationalism. And if we can maintain that sort of renegade spirit, that sort of spirit of non-conformity, and that spirit of, critical inquiry, like what do we want when we talk about, X, Y, and Z. That I think is the really kind of exciting legacy of Black nationalism, of a healthy strain of Black nationalism. Because certainly, like, there have been, unhealthy strains too, but Clegg's was spot on.
Awesome. Sorry, Elisa, did you have a thought on that?
Oh no, I was just so glad that Aaron got to talk about integration, because I was really hoping that he would talk about it. No, I just think that idea of like, what is it for, is like a really important, it's thrown around so much, but just +1 Aaron there.
Great, thanks so much, guys. We have another question from Karina, who said, I have a writerly question that I think is maybe relevant to writers as well. And she corrects us at Elisa, but I think this Aaron might also have some good thoughts on this. She says, Elisa, both Robinson's novels and your own essay are deeply informed by intense historical research, but don't wear that labor or information on the surface. How does the literary or even theological approach help us absorb something as vast and complicated and merciless as history?
Those are really good words to describe history. Karina. I was just rereading that Dietrich Bonhoeffer passage about history living between promise and fulfillment. I think that, he then goes on to anchor that fulfillment in God, but I was thinking about both the promise and the between period. And the fact that, some people refer to this time between the birth of Christ and Christ's return as the great parenthesis. Sometimes I feel like fiction is just offering a series of small parentheses in that sense. There are these, what I feel when I think about like really good fiction that's informed by history, whether or not it is, or perhaps writing that's informed by history, whether or not it is historical, is that it takes the opportunity offered by the parenthesis and shows you everything that can live inside that, or that there is an aperture there that helps you understand better something which is so difficult to grasp, like in its immensity. Who was it who said, like, when all of history is there Christ is, or something like that? I felt like there was something about that very true about the scale of that, like the impossibility of that also being there. But what I think Marilynne Robinson does is not necessarily, like, she's not really interested in like details that like plant us in a historical milieu. Like her sketchiness of history like kind of belies the like great profundity of understanding that I think goes underneath it. But where I think she does identify, really apt concerns is when she starts to think about like, what would people have said, or what would they have thought about this thing? And if you have a good imagination and a lot of research like she does, then I think you can illuminate in a way that, more conventional histories maybe can't.
Yeah.
Or at least they give us something to contend with. Anyway, Aaron.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, like anybody who knows me knows that I like Saidiya Hartman and like her work, right? And she is not a fiction writer, but she the way that she writes about, kind of how archives and the sort of lack of historical records, specifically about the lives of the enslaved, where that can seem like it closes off, all kind of avenues of writing about these lives. It actually provides a sort of launch pad, right, for rethinking like how you engage like with history and with archives. And so when you read like any of her work, but most notably her book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, what you'll ask is like, is this fiction or nonfiction? Like, where is she like leaning more on the imagination, and like where is she leaning like on the archives? And she is insistent that everything she writes is historically informed, right? And but as a reader, it's still a kind of magic, right? And so I think that it, like when I think about, kind of how like history informs the act of writing, I always think of Hartman, and I think of this sort of um, this really thin line between fiction and nonfiction, that I think is healthy to maintain. And theologically speaking, like again, I'm agnostic and think that doubt is both a comfortable and uncomfortable space. And so reading like Hartman is just, it's kind of a drug for me.
Karina popped back in to say critical fabulation.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
That's what it's called.
Thanks so much. By the way, these are great questions. Thank you guys so much for submitting them in the Q&A box. It's really wonderful. Another great question coming from Scott Sawyer. There's an accelerating and possibly irreversible of 20, 30, and 40 somethings from, broadly speaking, evangelical faith. And, in many, just in America, and just from religion in general. Does this lead to the possibility of a type of earnest faith rebuilt with both evangelical zeal and progressive vision from the ground up, or might it lead to something else? You guys have any thoughts on this?
First.
I mean, maybe. I don't. No, I don't. It's not that I don't have any thoughts. It just seems really hard to pronounce on. I hope that it leads to something positive, but it seems really hard to tell looking at what I know of the broad makeup of the evangelical church today. It's like,
Yeah, I think that, man, like that's a hard question. But like if we're talking about how to maybe channel the spirit of, evangelicalism, like, generally, when thinking about the work that churches can do specifically, I would, I guess, encourage churches to evangelize more among themselves, and say, like, this is the work we need to do to, like, make our institutions, matter to these, 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds who are leaving the church and not looking back, right? I have been in many churches, like, in my life, and what strikes me is, like, when I go back to the churches, like, of my childhood, and see just, these like empty pews, because people are either dead or have moved away, and it's not something that I feel like. It makes me sad, frankly, because these are the places where I felt, like, safe, and I felt kind of enveloped, like, in these meaningful communities. And I think that it's so urgent for more places, right, to think about, like, the ways that we can listen to the very people who left the church. I think that there should be outreach maybe to these people, and not like in an attempt to bring them back necessarily, but to ask, how can we help you, right? How can we be meaningful to your life?
I think the difficulty of this, I agree with that, Aaron, that I think the difficulty that you see in that is that, like, I mean, if you look at the SBC's recent Russell Moore ongoing problem, I mean, Russell Moore is not the problem, but the part of the problem is, like, an unwillingness for the church to acknowledge, like, ways in which it has harmed people who have left, either by not providing space for them, by espousing causes that they did not believe in, or by concealing, sexual abuse or other, kinds of things. And I think, again, there's a sort of, like, there's there has to be maybe, or like there needs to be some kind of deconcentration of power, or like just much more commitment to telling the truth and listening to people who are not powerful. That I think, like within the hierarchy of churches, for them to really change how that feels. I don't, that's what I was thinking about when I was thinking about the SBC. So.
Awesome, thank you guys. I've got a question from Steve, who asks, is one problem with the current concept of reparations the of the concept compared to the thick and complicated history of the Christian and Jewish concepts of repentance and reconciliation, and historical memory, and the manifold historical uses of these concepts in North Ireland or South Africa, etc.? Is that clear? Like the difference between kind of like a political usage of a term versus maybe something that's a kind of longer history or sort of rooted in theological language?
I think so. Yeah.
I'm not sure that it actually is then, but I think we could, I don't know.
We can riff.
We can riff. Well, I was just thinking that I think reparations, like Jesse McCarthy writes about the like multifold ways in which reparations can operate or can mean something in his very new book, Who Will Pay Reparations for My Soul? But that essay has been around for a while longer, I think. And he explicitly talks to Coates, you know, who was arguing for, you know, famously in 2014 made a brilliant, you know, essay that probably everyone has read about the case for material reparations from the state. And then I think from there, not from there, but, you know, there are certainly like smaller religious or ways in which churches and religious institutions are trying to like figure out their own role in that, as I think they should. But I think that the fact of like the debt is like, it's so big, you're never gonna pay it. And I actually think that it invites you to think of reparations as like an extremely complicated, the essay invites you to think of reparations as a very complicated thing. And also like that can be very fruitful, I think, for all of us to think about what does it mean to try to repay a debt that can never be made. And I mean, McCarthy explicitly talks about wrenching it out of a capitalist framework. Like, how do you take, like there might be a material component, but like, how do you take that away from a system which gave rise to chattel slavery in the first place? You know, that there is a contradiction there. So I think I'm curious what Aaron thinks, but I think like it is actually a very large word that is kind of flattened perhaps by a lot of popular conversation or political conversation, but
yeah,
is huge actually. So.
Yeah, like there are a lot of merits to the idea of forgiveness and repentance, but I will say that this, and you know, I'm not a theologian, but the notion of repentance has often been one of the most corrosive things to come out of of the church, because like, you know, for example, I was a kid and I felt great as a Christian because I knew that whatever naughty stuff I, you know, got up to, if I just like I got on my knees and said a prayer for 2 seconds, I was cleansed of that, and I didn't have to think about it at all. Like my job was done, you know. That was my kind of childhood understanding of how like mercy and grace, well, mercy worked, right? And I don't know the you know, Northern Irish and South African, you know, like histories like that well, but I will say that I think we have to, well, I think that churches will need to rethink what repentance actually means. Repentance, like reparations, is relational, right? And it is an ongoing thing, right? And that I think is what is often forgotten. So there has to be a way to reconcile like reparations and repentance to understand that both of those are things that just don't end, frankly, and that I think is hard for people to accept.
I 100% agree about the not ending thing, which is like, I think one of the problems that people have, where again, we move into the realm of the impossible or the impracticable. But yeah, it also makes me think a lot about like who you need to ask the question of like when it's done to, because like it's probably never done, but also like a lot of white institutions and white people will approach the question of reparations from like what they're willing to give or like what they think is feasible to give, whether it's material or not, whereas the offer, I feel, should be endless. And then, you know, for the descendants of enslaved people to then have the opportunity to say, what do they need? What do they want? Which might, I don't know, potentially give rise to more interesting conversations about what's possible.
Yeah. Oh, and right. So like with the South African context, I think the person means the truth and reconciliation, right? That was taking place. And right. And that is something that like we have seen the ways that our country has not is not willing to even engage in, you know, in that. And so, but I don't like want to end on a pessimistic note. So I'll stop there.
Well, I think we've got time for one more question, which hopefully will take us in a less pessimistic direction, or maybe more pessimistic. You have no idea. We've got a question from Amy, who asks, and I think this, well, actually, with our last one, she asks, I feel we are talking around the Christian concept of, quote, the common good. Do either of you guys have something to offer of the common good, either with relation to what we're talking about with reparations, or just what we're talking about generally when we're discussing kind of the relationship between individuals and institutions? Then to kind of extend that just a little bit, I'm just curious generally about what political movement for social justice might be missing if they don't have a religious inspiration, or what kind of falls out when something isn't grounded. What kinds of things might you guys want to see in certain types of political movements that you know, are maybe inspired by something that some sort of a form of community you experienced in your past might be missing in the present?
Mm-hmm. I guess so.
Good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So the common good, right? What is it, and how do we achieve it? It's I used to think that I had to think very like grandly about that, you know, like what the common good is. And I moved away, I think, from that, or I'm trying to move away from that and think about what does that mean for yourself? What does that mean for the community like that you're in, right? So I think the common good is like there are multiple levels to it, right? Like there is how you treat your next door neighbor, and there is whether you show up at whatever like local town hearings, there is whether you vote for, you know, for state or national elections. The important thing is not the level that your folk, well, I do think there should be you know structural like changes, but the most important thing is not the level of change. It is whether you are working with intention and intentionality. You know, if you nurse a general sense of like, you know, I'm trying to be a better person, I think it helps if we know like what that means, you know, for ourselves. In that way, I do think like it's a very kind of personal, you know, understanding of what the common good is. I don't think there is one common good, or right, but I do think that if we all, you know, if more people think of it that way, ideally, you would have a lot of people thinking about how we need to kind of search ourselves and search the context like of our lives more to answer that question. So yeah.
I think I think you articulated that really well, and it made me think about what I find myself orienting toward in my life. And I think probably because of reading various things, including like Cone, for instance, and Thurman, I've thought a lot more about what is for the good of the oppressed in a particular, or like what do people need, and like that sort of being more of a governing ethic than like the common good, which, like you, when I was little, I found kind of oppressively large, and like still sometimes feel it's very difficult to sort. But that the idea that like God is a God of and for the oppressed, and like what we do to further liberation and to lessen suffering, that is good. That I can really lean on, like even without thinking about God. What you were saying about Joey, about what was missing, was kind of interesting to me, because I was struck when I was rereading Aaron's essay earlier today, was also thinking about the and something else that I was reading today. Sorry, read too many things. But was about the kind of rhetoric of love and family, which I think can be quite toxic in the church. But like I do, sometimes miss like that sense, like the openness of love, the open-handedness of love, and like beautiful, good church environments. I do think is like something that I would like to see more of in the world, regardless of faith. Like I just keep talking about love. I don't know why.
Wait.
All right, thank you guys so much. We're about out of time now. I just wanted to mention one thing, Elisa. About 3 weeks ago, I had never heard of Russell Moore, but I was at the Plow Writers Retreat a couple weeks ago, and he came and spoke, and he actually spoke a lot about some of the topics you just brought up, about this question of sort of why we're, especially younger people, leaving the church. There's a common idea that it's about materialism, or because they, don't believe in the values of the church. And he said, no, it's actually that they don't believe the church believes in the values of the church. And he spoke about sort of exactly some of the things you brought up about listening to people who don't have a voice, and really, trying to find the truth. So anyway.
Have you read his resignation letter?
I read it.
If you haven't,
after that.
If anyone has not read his resignation letter, you should read it. It sets the house on fire. I mean, even if you don't agree with Russell Moore on like lots of things, it's well worth the read if you're interested. So, yeah.
Well, his talk did something similar at the conference. So it was cool you brought that up. And otherwise I just wanted to thank everyone. Thanks to Phil and Joey for moderating, and Joey and Rachel for helping us do this, and most of all to Elisa and Aaron. It's a privilege as an editor to get to work with writers like you and get to publish these kind of articles. And to the other also point staff, Karina, who asked the question, was very involved with editing both of your pieces. So I just wanted to acknowledge her contribution and bringing Elisa to us in the first place, I think, too. So anyway, thanks to everybody, and thanks to everyone for all these great questions. And as it says on the side, the conversation doesn't stop here. I hope you'll think about subscribing to Plow and The Point if you don't already, and continuing to see these kind of voices and many others as we go forward. So thank you guys.
Buddy, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.